My name is Alex, and I'm 36 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've been the black sheep of my family. It's not one of those things where I'm being overly sensitive or imagining slights where there aren't any. It's been painfully obvious my entire life. My younger brother, Nick, who's 32 now, has always been the favorite. The golden child. The one who could do no wrong. Growing up, everything Nick wanted, he got. It didn't matter if he earned it or not. Meanwhile, I had to fight for every little thing. The most glaring example that still stings to this day was when I got into a prestigious university on a partial scholarship. You'd think my parents would be proud or at least acknowledge it. Instead, it barely registered with them. They didn't celebrate or even ask much about it. It was like it didn't matter. Fast forward to a few years later, when Nick decided to go to a regular technical college. My parents threw him a huge party, inviting family and friends over to celebrate. But that wasn't even the worst of it. They bought him a brand new $40,000 car as a congratulations gift. At the time, I was riding my beat-up old bike to work, saving every penny just to get by. I couldn't believe the disparity, but when I brought it up, my mom brushed it off, saying Nick needed the support because school was going to be tough for him. It was always like that with Nick. He never had to work for anything because my parents made sure life was as easy as possible for him. And, honestly, I think it set him up to expect the world to cater to him. For me, it was the opposite. I worked 2 jobs in college to afford my living expenses. While Nick got everything handed to him, I had to struggle. But no matter how much I accomplished on my own, it was never enough to get my parents' attention. Even now, looking back, I think the favoritism wasn't just unfair, it was damaging. It created a rift between Nick and me, even though I tried so hard not to let it. He wasn't a bad kid, just spoiled. But as the years went on, I started resenting him for how easy everything seemed for him while I was breaking my back to make ends meet. It wasn't his fault, but at the same time he didn't do much to bridge the gap either. I can't count the number of times I tried to talk to my parents about it. Every time I brought up how I felt, they'd either dismiss me or turn it into some kind of guilt trip. My mom would say things like, "Why can't you just be happy for your brother?" Or, "You're so independent. We knew you didn't need us as much." It was maddening. I remember one Christmas when I came home after finishing my degree and landing a decent job. I thought maybe this time they'd recognize my hard work. Instead, the entire holiday revolved around Nick. He'd just started a new internship, and my parents acted like he'd cured cancer. Meanwhile, I was practically invisible. The worst part is, I started to believe them. I started to think maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I didn't deserve their attention or approval. It messed with my self-esteem in ways I'm still unpacking. It's hard not to internalize that kind of rejection when it's coming from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. Looking back now, I realize how toxic it all was. My parents weren't just playing favorites, they were creating a dynamic that pitted us against each other. And for a long time, it worked. I met Lauren when I was 28 through one of her friends who, ironically, had dated Nick at some point. Right away, she stood out. Lauren was everything I'd ever wanted. Smart, funny, ambitious, and absolutely beautiful. I couldn't believe someone like her was interested in me, especially after a lifetime of feeling like I was never quite good enough. We started dating, and those first few months were like something out of a movie. She was warm and encouraging, and for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to prove my worth to someone. Lauren genuinely cared about me for who I was, not for what I could do for her or how I measured up to someone else. By the time we'd been together for 5 years, I knew she was the one. I'd finally found someone I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Of course, my parents couldn't just let me have this happiness without throwing in some of their usual jabs. From the moment they met Lauren, the passive-aggressive comments started. My mom, in her classic way, would say things like, "What does a woman like that see in you?" Or, "You must have really lucked out, huh?" And sure, maybe on the surface they seemed like compliments, but I could hear the undertone. It was like they couldn't believe I was capable of landing someone amazing, as if Lauren being with me was some kind of fluke. Nick, on the other hand, took things to a whole different level. From the very beginning, he seemed a little too interested in Lauren. He'd ask her weirdly personal questions whenever we were all together. Stuff like, What do you see in Alex? Or, have you ever been with a guy like me? I tried to laugh it off at first, assuming it was just Nick being his usual self-absorbed, inappropriate self. But over time, it started to feel intentional, like he was trying to get under my skin. Lauren, for her part, handled it like a pro. She'd brush off his comments with quick, witty replies or just ignore him altogether. I could tell she didn't like the attention, but she never made a big deal out of it. I appreciated how graceful she was about it all, but deep down, it pissed me off. Nick had everything handed to him his whole life, and now he was trying to insert himself into the one thing I'd managed to build for myself. My relationship. I should have confronted him sooner, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of rocking the boat with my parents or dredging up old tensions. Or maybe I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he was getting to me. Instead, I tried to focus on Lauren and on building a future with her. But even when Nick wasn't around, my parents found ways to make their feelings known. During one family dinner, my mom made a point of asking Lauren, "Don't you think Nick would be a good match for someone like you? He's always had such a magnetic personality." Lauren gave her a polite but firm response. Something like, "I think I'm doing just fine with Alex, thanks." But it stung. My own mother couldn't just support me. She had to plant these little seeds of doubt, as if Lauren was somehow settling by being with me. Lauren reassured me constantly that she loved me and wasn't interested in Nick or anyone else, and I believed her. But the constant digs from my family, combined with Nick's weird behavior, made it hard to fully enjoy what we had. It felt like I was always fighting to prove myself, to Lauren, to my family, even to myself. Despite everything, Lauren and I were solid. We talked about marriage, kids, the life we wanted to build together. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a shot at something real and good. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my family, and Nick in particular, would find a way to sabotage it. About a year after Lauren and I got engaged, I started noticing subtle changes in her behavior. At first, I chalked it up to wedding planning stress or her demanding job. But over time, it became harder to ignore. She was constantly on her phone. Sending texts she'd tilt away from my line of sight. She started staying late at work more often than usual and seemed to avoid me when we were at home. I tried to be understanding, telling myself it was just a phase. I even convinced myself she might be exhausted or overwhelmed, especially since she'd been complaining of feeling unwell. She'd often excuse herself to the bathroom, and I started wondering if she might be pregnant. It was a hopeful thought, and I clung to it. Maybe that's why she was acting strange. Maybe she was trying to figure out the right time to tell me. But then one night, everything came crashing down. Lauren sat me down in our living room, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. I had no idea what was coming, but the look on her face was enough to make my stomach drop. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I'm pregnant."
At first, I felt this surge of relief and excitement. Despite all the weirdness lately, this was good news, or so I thought. Before I could even respond, she continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "But the baby isn't yours." For a moment, I didn't understand. My brain refused to process the words. It felt like time had stopped, like the world had gone completely silent except for the pounding of my own heart. "What?" I finally managed to choke out, though it came out more like a gasp. She started crying then, full-on sobbing, and I just sat there, frozen. I've been having an affair," she admitted. "With Nick." It felt like someone had punched me in the gut, knocking all the air out of my lungs. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My fiancée, the woman I'd spent years building a life with, was telling me she'd not only cheated on me but with my brother. And now she was carrying his child. I don't even remember how long I sat there, staring at her in disbelief. My mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had led to this moment. All the late nights, the secrecy, the distance, it all made sense now. And Nick, of course it was Nick. It always came back to him, didn't it? Lauren kept talking, trying to explain herself, but I barely heard her. Something about how it started as a mistake, how she didn't mean for it to happen, how she didn't know how to tell me. None of it mattered. None of it changed the fact that the two people I trusted most in the world had completely betrayed me. I felt anger, heartbreak, humiliation, all at once, like a storm raging inside me. And yet I couldn't move or speak. I just sat there, letting her words wash over me, as if hearing them would somehow make it hurt less. Didn't. Eventually, she stopped talking, her sobs filling the silence between us. I finally stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. "I need some time," I said, my voice cold and unfamiliar even to me. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and left the apartment. I walked for hours that night, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. I kept asking myself how I didn't see it sooner, how I could have been so blind. But more than that, I felt this crushing sense of betrayal. Nick had always taken everything from me, but this was something I never thought even he would stoop to. By the time I got back home, Lauren was asleep on the couch, her face red and puffy from crying. I didn't wake her. I just went to the bedroom, closed the door, and stared at the ceiling, wondering how the hell I was supposed to move forward from this. Couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything Lauren had said. The betrayal hit me in waves, each one more painful than the last. By the time the sun came up, I knew I couldn't just let her stay. I woke her up and told her to pack her things. She tried to argue, but I wasn't interested in hearing anything else from her. "This isn't your home anymore," I said, my voice ice cold. "You made your choice." She left without much of a fight, though she looked devastated. I wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. She'd blown up my life and destroyed everything we had built together. After she was gone, I called Nick. My hands were shaking as I dialed, and I could feel my blood boiling with every ring. When he finally picked up, his tone was so casual, so unaffected, it made me sick. "Nick," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk. What the hell is wrong with you?" He sighed like I was inconveniencing him. "Look, Alex, I'm sorry you found out this way, but things happen. People make mistakes." "Mistakes?" I practically shouted. "You slept with my fiancée. She's pregnant with your kid. And all you can say is mistakes happen?" That's when he said it. The line that would haunt me for weeks. "Maybe if you'd been a better boyfriend, she wouldn't have come to me." I froze, stunned into silence. The audacity, the smugness, it was like he didn't even care about what he'd done. For him, this was just another way to one-up me, another way to remind me that I'd never measure up in his eyes. I hung up without saying another word. I couldn't keep talking to him without completely losing it. But I wasn't done. I needed to confront my parents. Surely, they would see how wrong this was, how deeply Nick had crossed the line. When I called my mom later that morning, she sounded cheerful, like nothing was wrong. I told her everything. How Lauren had been cheating on me with Nick, how she was pregnant with his baby. I expected outrage or at least sympathy, but her response left me stunned. "Alex, I know this is hard for you," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But you need to forgive your brother. Family comes first." "Family comes first?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "He destroyed my relationship. He betrayed me in the worst way possible. And you want me to just forgive him?" "Nick made a mistake," she said, echoing his exact words. "You can't hold a grudge forever. He's your brother. You need to find a way to move on." My father was no better. When I tried to explain how hurt and angry I was, he dismissed me entirely. "You're being too emotional," he said. "These things happen. You need to be the bigger person." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just defending Nick. They were actively enabling him. They even went so far as to suggest helping him and Lauren with the baby. "They're going to need support," my mom said. "It's a big responsibility." I felt like I was losing my mind. How could they not see how wrong this was? How could they be so willing to overlook what Nick had done? Not just to me, but to Lauren too. It was like I didn't matter to them at all. My pain, my anger, my betrayal, it was all irrelevant compared to their golden boy. Nick could do no wrong in their eyes even now. I hung up that call feeling more alone than ever. My fiancée was gone. My brother had betrayed me, and my parents had made it clear whose side they were on. I had no one. No support, no family to lean on, nothing. The weight of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. I spent the rest of the day sitting in my empty apartment, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to cut ties with all of them and never look back, but another part of me, the part that had spent years trying to earn their approval, couldn't quite let go. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be alone. After that last conversation with my parents, I hit my breaking point. I cut off all contact with my family. I changed my phone number, blocked them on social media, and stopped responding to any messages or emails. I thought that if I removed myself from their toxic orbit, I could finally start to heal. But, of course, they didn't make it easy. My mother, in particular, seemed determined to drag me back into their chaos. She started showing up at my workplace unannounced, making a scene in front of my coworkers and clients. "You need to grow up, Alex," she'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This grudge is ridiculous. You're tearing this family apart." I tried to ignore her, walking past her without a word, but she wouldn't let up. One day, she brought a photo album filled with childhood pictures. She cornered me in the lobby of my office, flipping through the pages as if it would magically make me forget everything that had happened. "Look at this," she said, holding up a photo of me and Nick as kids. "You two were inseparable. Don't you remember how close we all used to be?" I couldn't take it anymore. I told her if she didn't leave, I'd call security. She left in a huff, but not before making a dramatic speech about how I was the one destroying the family, not Nick. Things escalated after that. I filed a lawsuit and got a restraining order against Nick and my parents. It wasn't an easy decision, but I needed to protect my peace. I couldn't keep living with them trying to insert themselves into my life. The restraining order was supposed to be my line in the sand, my way of saying, enough is enough. But even that didn't stop them. Nick, being Nick, decided the rules didn't apply to him. A few weeks after the restraining order was issued, he showed up at the gym where I worked out. At first, I tried to ignore him, but he kept following me around, making snide comments loud enough for others to hear. "What's the matter, Alex? Still mad because I'm better at everything?" I clenched my fists and kept walking, but he didn't stop. "You're so sensitive," he sneered. "No wonder Lauren got bored with you." That was it. I snapped. I turned around and told him to leave, reminding him about the restraining order, but he just laughed in my face. "What are you going to do? Cry about it?" Before I even realized what I was doing, I shoved him. He stumbled back, but then he came at me, throwing the first punch. What followed was an all-out brawl in the middle of the gym. People were shouting, phones were out recording, but in that moment I didn't care. All the anger, all the frustration I'd been bottling up, it all came pouring out. When it was over, we were both bruised and bloody, and the gym staff had called the police. Nick smirked as they cuffed me, like he'd won some kind of twisted game. To make matters worse, the fight went viral. Someone uploaded the video to social media, and within hours, it was everywhere. The comments were brutal. Strangers speculating about the fight, taking sides, making jokes. I felt humiliated all over again. Nick, of course, wasn't done. He filed a complaint against me for assault, conveniently leaving out the part where he'd violated the restraining order and thrown the first punch. My lawyer assured me we had a strong case, but the damage was already done. I couldn't believe how far things had spiraled. What had started as a betrayal by two people I thought I could trust had now turned into a public spectacle. I'd lost my fiancée, my family, and now it felt like I was losing my reputation too. The fallout from the fight with Nick left me more drained than I'd ever been. Everywhere I went in the city felt tainted. The places Lauren and I had gone together, the gym where Nick had taunted me, even my own apartment. It was all a constant reminder of how my life had unraveled. I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. The pain was too raw, the memories too overwhelming. I needed to start over somewhere far away. Luckily, my job had an office in San Francisco, and there was an opening for a position I was qualified for. It felt like the universe was throwing me a lifeline. I applied immediately, and when I got the transfer, It felt like the first bit of hope I'd had in months. This was my chance to build a new life, far away from all the chaos and betrayal. As I packed up my apartment, I felt lighter with each box I filled. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about something. But, of course, my family wasn't going to let me go without a fight. Somehow, they found out about my move, probably through one of my old neighbors or mutual acquaintances. A few days before I was set to leave, my mother showed up at my house unannounced. She wasn't alone. Nick and my father were with her, and the sight of them on my doorstep immediately filled me with dread. My mother was crying, clutching a tissue like it was some kind of prop. "Alex, you can't do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're destroying this family. Running away won't solve anything." I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. "Destroying the family?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "Nick slept with my fiancée. You sided with him. And now you think I'm the problem." Nick smirked, like he found the whole thing amusing. My father, as usual, stayed silent, letting my mother do all the talking. "Alex, please," she begged. "We can fix this. We're family. You belong here with us." I was done. Completely done. Without saying another word, I pulled out my phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, I explained that they were violating the restraining order. My mother tried to play the victim, crying and saying I was overreacting. But the officers weren't buying it. They escorted all three of them off my property, warning them not to come back. As I watched them leave, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. It was hard to cut ties with the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, but I knew it was the only way forward. They'd made their choices, and now I was making mine. The day of my move, I loaded up my car and took one last look at my apartment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. San Francisco represented a fresh start, a place where I could finally focus on myself without the weight of my family's dysfunction dragging me down. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to leave the pain behind and start over. My story with them might not have had a happy ending, but for the first time I was hopeful about writing a new chapter, one where I could finally be free. The day I drove out of my old city, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't felt in years. I'd sold my apartment, packed everything I owned into my car, and left behind the life that had brought me nothing but pain. No more awkward run-ins with Lauren or Nick. No more confrontations with my parents. No more constant reminders of the betrayal that had upended my life. San Francisco was my fresh start. No one here knew me as the guy whose fiancée cheated with his brother, or the black sheep of the family. I wasn't carrying any labels, no baggage that anyone could see. I was just Alex, a blank slate. I found a modest apartment not far from my new office. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and that was enough. For the first time in months, I started to feel a sense of control over my life. I spent my first weekend in San Francisco unpacking, walking around my new neighborhood, and taking in the sights. Everything felt new and full of possibility. Work was another bright spot. My new coworkers didn't know my history, and I didn't have to explain anything to them. I threw myself into my job, grateful for the distraction. The city itself was a welcome change too. The bustling streets, the colorful neighborhoods, the endless things to do. It all made me feel alive again. Of course, the pain didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when I'd think about Lauren and Nick, about the life I'd imagined for myself before it all fell apart. But those moments became fewer and farther between. I wasn't living in the shadow of their betrayal anymore. I was moving forward. I started going to therapy, something I'd been avoiding for years. It helped more than I expected. Talking to someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the situation gave me clarity. I began to unpack the years of favoritism, the constant struggle to prove myself, and the deep scars my family had left on me. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Little by little, I started building a life that felt like my own. I made new friends, explored the city, and even started picking up hobbies I'd always wanted to try but never had the time for. I took a cooking class, joined a hiking group, and found a gym where no one knew my story. There's still a long road ahead. I know healing isn't a straight path, and there will be setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. I've left behind the toxic family dynamics, the betrayal, and the endless comparisons. Now, it's about building something new, something that's mine. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I finally feel like I can breathe. I'm ready to start over and create the life I deserve.